They say the hardest stories to tell are the ones that come from the heart, the ones that break and heal at the same time. This is a story about a grandmother you'll never forget, a woman who faced betrayal, loss, and a pain so deep that it could have destroyed her. But instead, it made her stronger. It's a story of survival, resilience, and how one woman's fight for justice changed her family forever. In this incredible journey, you'll hear about a life that was shattered by secrets, by cruelty, and by a love so twisted, it turned into a nightmare. But through every dark chapter, one woman stood tall, holding on to the hope that no matter how broken she was, she could still rise. You'll see how she fought, not just for herself, but for the generations that followed. How she carried the weight of her family's past, only to turn that burden into the strength she needed to heal. Stay with me, and you'll understand why this story isn't just hers. It's a lesson for us all. It's about the strength we all have within us, even when we feel like we're at our lowest. It's about the power of forgiveness, the importance of family, and the bravery to stand up when it feels like everything is against you. Don't forget to subscribe, because this incredible journey of love, loss, and healing is something everyone deserves to hear. It's a reminder that no matter how broken the past may seem, the future can still be bright. This story is just beginning. Please subscribe now, and stay tuned for a story that will make you cry, reflect, and share with those you love. In the small town where she grew up, there was always a sense of safety, of quiet love in the air. The sound of birds chirping in the morning, the warm light filtering through the trees, and the scent of fresh bread baking filled the home she shared with her family. It seemed like the perfect place for a child to grow. But as the years passed, the young girl began to notice the cracks in the family's perfect facade. Her parents were always busy, too wrapped up in their own world to notice the growing tension between them. Their conversations, though always polite, lacked the warmth and connection she saw in the homes of her friends. But it wasn't just her parents. There was something about her family that felt off. There were too many things left unsaid. Too many moments that didn't feel quite right. It was her grandmother, however, who was the one constant in her life. Every time she ran to her with a scraped knee or a broken heart, Grandma was there, arms wide, offering a comforting hug, a kind word, and a soft smile that felt like home. She was everything the young girl needed, a beacon of hope in a world that often felt uncertain. But even Grandma wasn't perfect. In the late nights when the girl would wander into the kitchen for a glass of water, she'd sometimes catch her grandmother staring out the window, lost in thought. Her face twisted in a way that suggested she was carrying something heavy, a secret maybe, something the girl didn't understand but could sense was there, hovering just out of reach. Grandma's eyes would always soften when she noticed the girl standing there, and she'd quickly turn away, pretending nothing was wrong. Still, for all her quiet sadness, Grandma's love was unwavering. It was the one thing the girl could always count on. But as the years passed, that security began to crack as well. The first real blow came when the young girl's mother fell ill. It wasn't sudden, and yet it seemed to come out of nowhere. One moment she was fine, and the next she was confined to a bed, pale and weak, with eyes that no longer held the spark of life she once had. The doctors couldn't explain it, and despite their best efforts, her mother's condition only worsened. As the days turned into weeks, the young girl noticed a change in her grandmother. The warmth that once radiated from her seemed to dim, replaced by a coldness the girl couldn't understand. At night, Grandma would sit by the window again, her back hunched and her hands clasped tightly, as if holding on to something that was slipping away. The unspoken tension between them grew, and the girl could no longer deny it. The grief was too heavy to ignore. Then came the day when everything changed. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the world feels quiet, muffled by the sound of raindrops. The girl had been playing in the yard, her thoughts still on the fact that her mother wasn't getting better. When she walked inside, She found her grandmother standing by the door, her eyes red, her face pale. She didn't need to ask what had happened. Grandma's hand trembled as she reached for the girl, but it was too late. Her mother had passed away, slipping away in the night, and with her death came a silence so deep it filled the house, leaving a hollow echo behind. The grief was overwhelming, suffocating, yet it was just the beginning of something much darker. Grandma tried to hold it together, but the truth was, she couldn't. The first major tragedy of the young girl's life had already struck, and now, as the days passed, the real pain began to surface. She was left to pick up the pieces of a broken family, while the shadow of betrayal loomed just out of reach. As the days and months passed after her mother's death, the young girl found herself grappling with more than just the loss. Something had shifted in her grandmother. A coldness in the way she looked at her. A distance that had never been there before. It was as if the warmth that once defined their bond had begun to dissipate, leaving an unfamiliar, chilling void. Grandma's eyes, once full of love, had become hollow, and the weight of unspoken things seemed to hang over them both. At first, the girl couldn't put her finger on what was wrong. Her grief and confusion clouded her understanding, but as she grew older, she began to sense the shadows that had always lingered at the edges of their home. There were whispers, small, fleeting comments she overheard when adults thought she wasn't listening. She'd hear her grandmother mutter under her breath at night, a name she hadn't heard before. Walter. There was also a mention of her mother's father, who had disowned her mother years ago, and another name she didn't recognize. Sharon. These whispers stirred something inside her, a sense of unease she couldn't shake. She would ask Grandma about them, but each time her grandmother would simply smile weakly and change the subject. "You don't need to worry about that," Grandma would say, her voice flat. "That's all in the past." But the words always felt like lies, and the girl's curiosity grew, gnawing at her like a slow-burning fire. It wasn't until one fateful afternoon that the truth came crashing down. She was 16 now, and her world was filled with a tangled mix of grief, confusion, and unanswered questions. One rainy day, she found herself sorting through some old family photos, her fingers tracing the edges of worn, yellowed pictures of her mother as a young woman. She came across a picture of her mother and her grandmother, taken long before the girl was born, both of them smiling, the weight of the years yet to come not yet burdening their faces. The girl felt a pang of longing as she stared at the image, wishing things could have been different, wishing her mother was still here with her, healthy and whole. But then, she noticed something strange. In the corner of the photo, barely visible at first, was a man. A tall, dark-haired figure standing a little too close to her mother, his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that felt wrong. She squinted, and it hit her like a punch to the stomach. His eyes. The same eyes she had seen in a darkened corner of her memories. Walter. The man whose name she had overheard. She froze, a shiver running down her spine, as a flood of realization washed over her. She dug through the box of old photos, desperate to find more, her hands shaking with fear and anticipation. There were more photos, each one revealing more about her mother's past, about Grandma's past, about the truth that had been buried for so long. Then, she found it. A letter. Its edges were torn, yellow with age, but the words on the paper were clear. It was from Grandma to a man named Walter, the same man who had been in the photos. The words were full of longing, regret, and something darker, more manipulative. As she read, the words blurred together, and a sickness began to churn in her stomach. Walter had been more than just a man from their past. He was someone who had manipulated and controlled her mother, someone who had been involved in things the girl couldn't even comprehend. The letter spoke of promises, of lies, and a life that had been stolen. And in the midst of it all, her grandmother's silence weighed heavily. The girl's heart hammered in her chest as she pieced together the nightmare her family had been living all along. She confronted her grandmother that night, her voice trembling but full of anger. "What is all of this? Who is Walter? What did he do to Mom?" Her grandmother didn't meet her gaze. She simply stared at the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if bracing for the weight of the storm that was coming. "You don't understand," Grandma whispered, her voice distant, as if lost in the very memory of what had happened. "There are things in life we do to survive. There are choices we make that we wish we could undo." The girl's eyes burned with tears. "But you let him do this to Mom, and to me. You let it happen." Her grandmother's face tightened. The pain of years of hidden truths etched deep into her wrinkles. "I didn't want to," she said quietly, "but I didn't know what else to do. He was powerful. He had money and he had connections. Your mother, she was never supposed to be part of his world. But he wouldn't let her go. And I couldn't protect her. I couldn't protect you." It was in that moment that the girl understood. Her mother's death hadn't been an accident. It wasn't just illness that had taken her. It was the toll of a life lived under the shadow of manipulation, control, and violence. The truth about her grandmother's role in all of it was more painful than the death of her mother itself. Her grandmother's life had taken a dark turn long before the girl was born. The cycle of abuse had begun with her mother, and now it was clear. She had been sold, manipulated, betrayed by the one person who should have protected her. And now the girl was left with the ruins of a family broken by secrets. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the truth settled over the girl like a suffocating blanket. The more she learned, the more the world she once knew began to feel like a distant memory. Her trust in everyone around her shattered, replaced with an overwhelming sense of betrayal. She was angry at her grandmother, at her mother for not being strong enough to escape, and at herself for not realizing sooner. Yet, amid the swirling storm of emotions, anger, fear, hopelessness, a spark of determination began to form. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting for justice. The girl couldn't change the past, but she would be damned if she let it destroy her. The truth had come out, and with it came the understanding that her battle was just beginning. The phone call came early in the morning, just as the first light of day broke through the clouds. The soft gray dawn seemed like an omen, a sign of the heaviness that was about to fall. The girl had been drifting in and out of sleep, her mind restless from the weight of everything she had learned, everything she had discovered about her family. But when the phone rang, her heart sank before she even answered. "She's gone." It wasn't even a question. Her grandmother's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she had already said those words 1,000 times in her head. The girl couldn't find her voice, couldn't say anything in return. It was as though her body had frozen, her heart already in mourning before the finality of the words even settled in. She wanted to scream, to run to her mother's side, but there was nothing she could do. Her mother was gone. Her mother, the woman who had been her world, who had held her when she was scared, who had soothed her with soft whispers and promises that everything would be okay, had slipped away in the night, alone and uncomforted. The hospital had called hours before, but by the time the girl made it there, the coldness in the room told her all she needed to know. It was too late. In the sterile white hospital room, with the quiet hum of machines and the faint smell of antiseptic in the air, the girl stood there, staring at the lifeless form of the one person who had been everything to her. It was hard to recognize her mother's face, pale and still. The warm, vibrant woman who had once held so much life in her now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by this cold, fragile shell. Her grandmother was sitting at the foot of the bed, her face drawn, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked so small, so fragile, as though all the years of pain had finally caught up to her. The girl wanted to run to her, to cry, to scream, but instead, she stood frozen, unsure of what to feel. Grief wrapped itself around her like a thick fog, suffocating her, numbing her to the world around her. The funeral was a blur of faces, empty words, and rituals that felt foreign to the girl. The world seemed to move in slow motion, like she was walking through a dream. People whispered condolences, their voices distant, as if they were speaking from another world. Her grandmother, stoic and unmoving, stood by her side, the only constant in a world that no longer made sense. Yet, the more the girl looked at her, the more she realized that even her grandmother wasn't there in the way she used to be. She was a shadow of the woman she had once been, and the weight of that shadow only deepened the girl's isolation. She had never felt more alone in her life. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter, the smell of her mother's cooking, and the warmth of family, now felt hollow, empty. The girl wandered through the rooms, touching things that no longer held meaning. Her mother's favorite mug sitting abandoned on the kitchen counter, her scarf draped over the chair where she always sat to read. Nothing felt right. The absence of her mother was too much to bear. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the silence was deafening. Days turned into weeks, and still, the grief didn't ease. It didn't help that her grandmother, who had always been a source of comfort, had become a stranger in her own home. There were no more quiet conversations, no more soft words of reassurance. Instead, Grandma buried herself in her own grief, shutting the girl out completely. It was as though they were both drowning in their own pain, unable to help each other. The girl longed for her mother, for the feeling of being held, for someone to tell her it would be okay, even when it wasn't. But there was no one left to comfort her. There were only the empty rooms, the hollow silence, and the memories of a love that had been ripped away too soon. Each night, as the darkness settled in, the girl would lie in bed, clutching the pillow her mother used to rest her head on, trying to find solace in the smell of lavender that still lingered in the fabric. But no matter how hard she tried, it never felt like enough. Her mother's absence was a wound that wouldn't heal, a pain that she couldn't escape. And so the days passed in a blur. The girl tried to keep herself busy, reading, cleaning, anything to keep the suffocating silence at bay. But it didn't help. No matter how many tasks she took on, no matter how hard she tried to keep her mind occupied, she could never escape the truth. Her mother was gone, and she was alone. The grief consumed her, like an endless tide, pulling her under, leaving her gasping for air. It wasn't just the loss of her mother. It was the loss of everything she had ever known. The family she thought she could trust, the safety she once felt, all of it was gone. And now, standing at the edge of a world she didn't recognize, she had to figure out how to keep moving forward, even though every step felt like a battle. The days that followed her mother's funeral were a blur of cold, numbing silence. The world outside seemed to continue moving, but inside the girl's house, time had frozen. Her grandmother, once her guiding light, was now a shell of the woman she had been. She rarely left her room, and when she did, she moved with a quiet, haunted presence, as if something inside her had broken. The girl, in turn, withdrew into herself. She spent her days wandering through the house, unsure of what to do, what to feel. She was alone in a way that went beyond the physical absence of her mother. The betrayal of her family, of the secrets that had been kept from her, hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. It was late one evening when the storm finally came. The girl was sitting in the dimly lit living room, curled up on the couch, trying to find comfort in the fading light of the television. The silence was oppressive, the weight of everything too much to bear. The distant sound of footsteps on the stairs broke through the quiet, and before she could even react, her grandmother entered the room. She didn't look at the girl, but instead, stared out the window, her hands trembling as they rested on the back of the chair. "Your aunt is coming by tomorrow," her grandmother said, her voice distant and cold. It was the first time in days that she had spoken with any hint of authority. "Aunt Sharon?" the girl asked, the name hanging in the air like a forgotten memory. She hadn't heard from her aunt in months, maybe even years. Their relationship had always been strained, filled with an unspoken tension that the girl couldn't fully understand. Aunt Sharon had never been particularly kind, but the girl hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, with everything that had happened, she wasn't so sure. Grandma nodded, her eyes distant. "She wants to discuss your future." "Discuss my future?" The girl sat up straighter, her heart racing. She hadn't even thought about her future. After the loss of her mother, it felt like her world had been shattered. There was no future to consider, just an endless present filled with grief and confusion. But the next day, Aunt Sharon arrived as promised, her presence as cold and unforgiving as ever. She was older than Grandma by a few years, but there was something in her eyes that always seemed to make the girl feel small, insignificant. Sharon's sharp features were drawn tight, her lips set in a permanent frown. When she walked into the house, she didn't greet the girl with the warmth of family. She simply nodded, her gaze flicking over her as if she were a stranger. "Let's get this over with," Aunt Sharon said, her voice devoid of emotion. "We have important matters to discuss." The girl followed her to the kitchen, her heart hammering in her chest. She had no idea what this conversation was about, but she knew it couldn't be good. As they sat down, Sharon wasted no time. There was no pleasantry, no small talk. "You're of marrying age now," Aunt Sharon began, her words as cold as ice. "And you've got no future here. Your grandmother is too old to take care of you. You're not a child anymore, and it's time you started thinking about your own future." The girl's mind raced. "What do you mean? I don't need a marriage right now. Aunt Sharon cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Don't be foolish. This is the way it has to be. I've made arrangements." "Arrangements?" The girl's voice trembled. "What arrangements?" Aunt Sharon's lips curled into a thin, calculating smile. "I've spoken to Walter Bishop. He's agreed to take you as his wife. He's a good man, wealthy, well-respected. He'll provide for you, give you a life. It's what's best for you." The words hung in the air like poison, slowly sinking in. Walter Bishop, the man whose name had been whispered in the shadows of her family's past, the man whose presence had haunted her mother's memories, the same man who had ruined so much of her mother's life. And now he was supposed to be her future. "No," the girl whispered, her throat dry, her voice a mix of shock and revulsion. "I won't do it." Aunt Sharon's expression darkened. "You'll do as I say. You have no choice. There's no one left to take care of you. Your mother is gone. Your grandmother is incapable. Walter can give you a roof over your head, food to eat, security. You'll marry him and you'll be grateful." The girl's stomach churned as the truth sank in. Her aunt had sold her mother to Walter Bishop, and now she was going to sell her as well. It wasn't about love. It was about survival. A survival that had been bought and sold, manipulated by the very people she had trusted most. She had never felt more like a commodity in her life, but something inside her flickered, a small flame of resistance. "I won't do it," she repeated more forcefully this time, her fists clenched at her sides. "I'd rather live on my own. I don't need your help. I don't need his." Aunt Sharon's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "You think you have a choice? Without Walter, you're nothing. You're just a girl without a family, without anyone to protect you. He's your only chance." The girl stood up, shaking with anger, the weight of her circumstances pressing down on her. "I don't care what you say. I'll never marry him. I won't be your pawn." Her aunt's smile faltered, but she didn't back down. "We'll see. You'll learn soon enough that life isn't as easy as you think." As Aunt Sharon left, the girl stood in the empty kitchen, her heart pounding. For the first time since her mother's death, a spark of defiance flickered within her. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something that told her she didn't have to let them control her. She might not have a family anymore. She might not have anyone to protect her. But there was one thing she still had, her will to survive. And for the first time, the girl realized that fighting for her freedom was the only choice she had left. The days bled together, one indistinguishable from the next. The girl's life, once full of possibility and dreams, now felt like a prison. The walls of her world had closed in around her. No longer the comforting embrace of her home, but a suffocating cage. Every decision, every moment, was dictated by someone else's will. She had no voice, no say, no freedom. Her grandmother's silence had become unbearable, a constant reminder of the loss they both shared. Grandma, once a comforting presence, now seemed to shrink into herself, weighed down by her own regrets and fears. She barely spoke to the girl anymore, retreating into her room, her eyes vacant, as if the life had been drained from her along with her daughter. It was as if the weight of the past had become too much to bear. Aunt Sharon, on the other hand, was a constant, looming presence in the house. Cold, calculating, and unyielding, she controlled every aspect of the girl's life. The proposal to marry Walter Bishop had come and gone, but the threat still hung over her like a sword poised to fall. Sharon made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that there were no other options for the girl. Walter's proposal wasn't a suggestion. It was a condition of her survival. Marry him, or be abandoned to a life of nothing. At first, the girl resisted. She cried, she screamed, she begged for an escape. But Sharon's response was always the same. Silence, followed by a cold dismissal. The girl had no one to turn to. Her mother was gone, and her grandmother was a shadow of her former self. The walls were closing in tighter, her sense of self slipping through her fingers like sand. Every day felt like a death sentence. Her life had become a monotonous cycle. Wake up early, eat the bland, tasteless meals Sharon prepared, work tirelessly around the house, and then go to bed, exhausted and drained. The days blurred together in an endless loop of servitude. There was no joy in her work, no hope in her actions, just the endless, crushing weight of compliance. Sharon's orders were constant and unyielding. The girl was expected to help with the housework, prepare meals, and run errands, tasks that left her exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Every time she felt the flicker of resistance rise within her, Sharon's sharp gaze would cut through her, reminding her of the stakes. If she fought back, there would be consequences. Walter Bishop was always just one step away, waiting for her to submit. And if she didn't, the consequences would be too great to bear. She became a prisoner in her own life, her mind and emotions shackled by the chains of fear and helplessness. There were no moments of respite, no chance to escape the suffocating grip of her circumstances. Every decision, every action was watched, controlled, dictated. She was no longer a person. She was an object, a thing, something to be managed, something to be owned. But even in the darkest moments, a flicker of defiance remained. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. When Sharon wasn't watching, when the house was quiet, the girl would take a deep breath and close her eyes. In the silence, she would whisper to herself, "I will survive this," at night. She would sometimes lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember who she had been before all of this, before the darkness of betrayal, before the crushing weight of isolation. She would think of the dreams she had once held, the life she had imagined for herself. And even though they seemed so far away now, they were still there, buried deep inside her. They hadn't been taken from her, not yet. Slowly, she began to find small ways to reclaim her mind, to resist the control Sharon had over her. It wasn't much, just little acts of rebellion that no one would notice, like taking an extra moment to breathe when she was overwhelmed, or silently counting the minutes until she could escape to her small, dark corner of the house where she could be alone with her thoughts. She would steal moments of peace, even if it was just for a few seconds, and in those seconds, she would remind herself that she wasn't completely lost. She was still there, still herself. Some nights, when she felt the overwhelming sense of defeat creeping in, she would reach for the tattered book her mother had once kept hidden in the back of the closet. A journal filled with her mother's thoughts, hopes, and dreams. The girl had never read it before, but now it was her only connection to the woman who had loved her unconditionally. She would read the pages, her heart aching with each word, feeling the weight of her mother's absence all over again, but also feeling the strength of her mother's spirit rising up from the pages. It was in those moments, in the quiet solitude of the night, that the girl began to realize something. She was still alive. No matter how controlled, no matter how isolated, no one could take that away from her. She was still capable of hope, of feeling, of wanting more than just the life that had been forced upon her. And that, in itself, was a kind of power. She wasn't sure how or when it would happen, but deep down, she knew that she would fight back. She would find a way to escape the chains that bound her, to break free from the life that had been thrust upon her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she could still control her own fate. The days were long, and the nights even longer. The girl moved through her days like a shadow of herself, going through the motions, completing the chores, and enduring the cold silences. Yet beneath the numb exterior, a quiet storm was building within her, a storm of questions, of anger, and finally of clarity. She had spent months trying to escape the suffocating grip of her family's manipulation, but it wasn't until she uncovered the truth about her mother's past that the floodgates opened, and everything changed. It started with an old, dusty chest in the attic, a relic from another time. She had seen it many times before, always tucked away in the corner, always ignored, as if it were too painful to be opened. But one day curiosity got the better of her. As she cleaned the attic, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important inside that chest, something that might finally explain the darkness that loomed over her family, that might answer the questions she had kept buried for so long. Her hands shook as she lifted the heavy lid, the air thick with the musty scent of old paper and forgotten memories. Inside, she found photographs, letters, and books, things that had once held meaning, now faded and forgotten. But it was a bundle of old letters, tied together with a fraying piece of string, that caught her attention. She pulled them out, her heart pounding, as she carefully untied the bundle. The first letter was dated over 20 years ago, written in her mother's handwriting. The words on the paper were shaky, uncertain, but they were enough to send a chill down her spine. I'm so afraid. I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. Walter's eyes, there's something in them that terrifies me. He said he would always be watching. I don't know if I can escape. The girl felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she read on. The letter spoke of secrets too dark to be acknowledged, of a life her mother had never told her about. One that had been ruled by a man who had twisted her mother's love, her trust, and ultimately her will. She read letter after letter, each one unraveling a new piece of the horrific puzzle that had been her mother's life. Walter Bishop was more than just a distant figure from the past. He had been a constant shadow, a man who had manipulated and controlled her mother into submission. It was clear now that her mother had never been the free, strong woman she had imagined. She had been trapped, ensnared in a web of lies and abuse, all at the hands of the man who now had his sights set on the girl herself. Her fingers trembled as she turned the final letter over. The words written on the back made her blood run cold. Your Aunt Sharon helped him. She made sure I never escaped. She agreed to sell you too when the time came. She said it would be good for you. The girl's heart hammered in her chest, and the room spun around her. She wanted to scream, to shout, to confront her grandmother, her aunt, anyone, but the weight of the words kept her frozen. Her own family had conspired to trap her, to sell her into the same fate that had destroyed her mother. The woman who had once been her anchor, her protector, had not only known about the abuse, but had helped it along. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. She sank to her knees, clutching the letters in her hands, her body racked with the shock of it all. For so long she had believed in the lie that her family was simply broken by grief, by circumstance. But this was something far worse. This was manipulation, cruelty, and deceit. Tears filled her eyes as the weight of her mother's pain became her own. All these years, she had been unknowingly walking the same path, heading toward the same fate. She couldn't even bring herself to look at her grandmother anymore, knowing that this woman, this person she had trusted, had known about it all. And Aunt Sharon, the woman who had come into their lives with her cold, calculating ways. She had been the one who had signed her mother's death sentence, and now intended to do the same to her. But in that moment, as the tears blurred her vision, something else flickered inside her, something fierce, something untamable. It wasn't just sorrow that filled her now. It was rage, and with that rage came clarity. She had the power to change her life. She wasn't bound by the chains of her family's cruelty anymore. She was stronger than that, stronger than they had ever given her credit for. She stood up slowly, her fists clenched at her sides. The girl realized that she didn't have to submit. She didn't have to let them control her life any longer. She had seen enough, endured enough to know that she could fight for her freedom. Even if it meant losing everything, even if it meant facing Walter and Sharon head-on, she would do it. She would fight for herself, for her future, and for the memory of her mother. With trembling hands, she folded the letters and placed them back in the chest. She didn't need them anymore. She had all the proof she needed in her heart. The truth was now in her hands. The time for silence was over. The time for submission was over. It was time for her to take control. As she descended the stairs, her resolve hardened. She would leave this house. She would break the cycle of abuse, even if it cost her everything. It was her turn to rise from the ashes of her family's lies. No more manipulation, no more submission. She was going to fight for the life she deserved. The house felt smaller than ever. Each creaking floorboard seemed to mock her as she walked through the dimly lit hallways, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls, once comforting, now felt like prison bars, closing in around her. The girl had made her decision. She could no longer stand by, silent and submissive, while the family that had raised her buried the truth. No longer would she let them control her future. Today, she was going to confront the people who had shaped her past, and her mother's, and take back the power they had stolen from her. She found her grandmother sitting by the window, as she often did now, staring blankly at the world outside. The girl's throat tightened as she stepped closer, the letters she had found still clenched tightly in her hand. She had spent the last few hours gathering every bit of courage she could muster, but as she stood there, facing the woman who had once been her protector, she felt the weight of years of betrayal pressing down on her. "Grandma," she said, her voice steady but cold, "we need to talk." Her grandmother didn't look at her, but there was a slight shift in her posture, a tightening of her hands. She knew what was coming. The girl could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes, even though the woman remained silent. "You knew," the girl said, her voice shaking with anger. But she forced herself to stay calm. "You knew everything. About Walter, about Aunt Sharon, about the lies. You knew what happened to Mom, and you didn't stop it. You let it happen." For a long moment there was nothing but silence, the air thick with years of unresolved pain. Her grandmother finally turned to face her, and for the first time in a long while, the girl saw something resembling emotion in her eyes. But it wasn't regret or sorrow. It was fear. Fear that she might lose the last connection she had to her past, the girl herself. "I never wanted this for you," Grandma whispered, her voice ragged. "I never wanted you to be caught in the same trap your mother was in. But I couldn't stop it. I didn't have the strength to protect her. Or you." The girl's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You did have the strength. You chose not to fight. You let Walter take her. You let Aunt Sharon destroy her. And now you're going to let her destroy me, too." Her voice rose with every word, the weight of years of silent suffering finally breaking free. Her grandmother's face crumpled, her eyes welling with tears. "I was afraid. I didn't know what else to do. He had so much power. He could have destroyed us all." "And you were willing to let him destroy us?" The girl shot back, her heart aching with the truth. "You were willing to sacrifice my future just like you sacrificed my mother's, but not anymore. I won't be your victim. I won't be anyone's victim." Her grandmother reached for her, but the girl stepped back, shaking her head. She couldn't let herself be pulled back into the trap. She had already spent too many years drowning in the lies and fears that had held her family captive. She was done. "You're wrong," the girl continued, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. "I'm not just your granddaughter. I'm my own person, and I refuse to let the past control me anymore." She turned away, unable to look at her grandmother any longer. The pain in her heart was suffocating, but there was something else now, something stronger. The resolve to fight. She couldn't undo the past, but she could damn well shape her future. As she headed for the door, her grandmother's voice, weak and pleading, stopped her. "Please, don't leave. Please understand. I did it because I was trying to protect you. I couldn't protect your mother, but I thought I could protect you. I thought this would be the only way you'd have a future." The girl's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to break down, to scream at the woman who had betrayed her, who had failed her, but she couldn't. She wouldn't let herself be that weak anymore. The pain would always be there, but she couldn't let it consume her. She turned, facing her grandmother one last time. "You can't protect me anymore. I have to protect myself." With that, she left the room, the house, and everything she had known. Her heart was heavy, but she could feel the weight lifting with each step she took toward freedom. She didn't know what the future held, or where she would go, but one thing was clear. She had to leave. For her own sanity, for her own future, she could never go back to the life that had been forced on her. The confrontation with her grandmother was only the beginning. The girl still had to face Aunt Sharon, the woman who had sold her mother and now intended to do the same to her. The anger inside her was no longer just about the betrayal. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen from her. Her dignity, her power, her future. And if that meant going against everything she had ever known, then so be it. She was ready to fight. The courthouse loomed before her, its cold stone walls towering over the street like a monument to everything she had fought against. The girl, no longer just a girl, but a young woman who had faced more than most could imagine, felt small in its shadow. She had been here before, in the hallways, in her dreams, where she had imagined this moment 100 times. But now that she was standing on the precipice of it, the weight of what she was about to do felt crushing. This was more than just a battle for justice. It was a battle for her soul. Her heart thudded in her chest as she walked through the heavy doors, her every step echoing in the vast emptiness of the courtroom. She had come this far, but the path ahead was a jagged one. She had to confront not only the man who had destroyed her family, but the reality of everything that had happened to her mother, and the family members who had sold her to that very man. Walter Bishop sat across the room, a picture of arrogance, his cold eyes scanning her as if she were no more than a nuisance. He hadn't changed. The man who had destroyed so many lives was still as smug, as entitled, as he had been when she was a child. He had always thought he could control everything and everyone. Her mother, her grandmother, and now her. But she wasn't his anymore. She was taking back her life, and this time she would win. Her lawyer, Ryan, gave her a quiet, reassuring glance as they approached the witness stand. His kind eyes met hers, filled with a quiet strength that had become her anchor throughout this battle. He had been her lifeline, helping her gather the courage to face this. Without him, without the small network of people who had rallied behind her, she never would have made it this far. But now, as the moment of truth loomed, the fight felt insurmountable. The first few hours of the trial were a blur. The room was filled with legal jargon that she barely understood, and every minute felt like an eternity. She could hear Walter's lawyer speaking, twisting the truth, painting her mother as a liar, painting her as a woman who had simply made poor choices. Every word stung, but she refused to let it break her. It was when she was called to the stand that everything changed. She walked to the witness box, her legs shaking, but her resolve steady. As she sat down, her hands trembled, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, to focus. She had to do this. For herself. For her mother. For every woman who had ever been silenced. The prosecutor asked her the first question, his voice steady and calm. "Tell us what happened, Miss Campos. What do you remember about your mother's relationship with Mr. Bishop?" The girl's throat tightened, but she spoke, the words spilling out like the truth she had been carrying for so long. "I remember my mother being afraid of him. She was never the same after she met him. She would always tell me that I was the only thing keeping her going. But she was so scared, so broken." Her voice faltered, but she held it together, forcing the next words through. "She tried to protect me, but I saw the bruises on her arms. I heard the way she cried in the middle of the night, and I saw the way he looked at her, like she was nothing more than property." The room was silent as the weight of her words settled over them. Her heart was in her throat, her body trembling, but she pushed through. She had to finish this. "Mr. Bishop never let her go," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "He didn't just take her physically, he took her spirit. And when she died, when she was gone, I had to live with the fact that no one protected her. No one protected us." The tears that had been building finally broke free, rolling down her cheeks. But she didn't wipe them away. "I want justice for her. I want justice for all the women who he's hurt." She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, but all she could see was Walter. His smug expression, the arrogance in his posture made her blood boil. But in that moment, as she finally faced the monster who had haunted her life, she found the courage she needed. She was no longer that scared little girl. She was a woman who had seen the truth, who had learned to fight for it, no matter what the cost. The defense attorney tried to discredit her, to twist her words, to undermine her credibility. But she refused to back down. Every question, every objection only made her stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the truth to be heard, for the lies to be exposed. And when Walter took the stand, her blood ran cold. He sat there, his cold eyes fixed on her, as he denied everything. He spoke in that low, guttural voice, twisting the facts, denying the pain he had caused. But even as he spoke, she could see it, his fear. His carefully crafted facade was crumbling. He knew it, and she knew it. Ryan stepped in, expertly cross-examining him, forcing him to contradict himself at every turn. The truth was like a rope tightening around Walter's neck, and it was clear to everyone in the room that the man had no defense for his actions. The climax of the trial came when the judge called for a recess. She walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. The battle wasn't over yet, but she knew she had done everything she could. She had told the truth, and in doing so, she had taken back her power. When the trial resumed, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty. Walter Bishop was sentenced to life in prison for the crimes he had committed against her mother and against countless other women. The relief that flooded through the girl's body was almost overwhelming, but it wasn't just the legal victory that had freed her. It was the realization that she had confronted her past head-on, that she had faced her demons and survived. As she left the courtroom, Ryan at her side, the girl felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would still be difficult. She would still carry the weight of her past with her, but for the first time in her life she felt free. And in that freedom, she found something she had lost long ago: hope. The courtroom was unnervingly quiet as the girl sat, waiting for her moment to speak. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat a reminder of what was at stake, not just the pursuit of justice, but her own sense of self. The weight of the past, of everything she had endured, seemed to hang in the air, suffocating her. For so long she had lived in silence, buried under the weight of family secrets, lies, and betrayal. But now the truth was finally coming to light. She had fought her way here, through the pain, the isolation, the shame, and now all she had to do was speak. But the silence was deafening. Across from her, Walter Bishop sat with his lawyer, his smug expression barely masked by the forced professionalism of his suit. He had no idea what he was about to face, no idea how much he had already lost. The girl watched him closely, her fingers trembling on the edge of the table. This was the man who had torn apart her family, the man who had ruined her mother's life. And now she was here to make him face the consequences. Her lawyer, Ryan, leaned in slightly, his voice a whisper of reassurance. "You've got this. You've already done the hardest part, facing him." His words were meant to comfort, but they did little to ease the knot in her stomach. It was hard to believe she had come this far, but she had. And now, for the first time, she felt the full force of the battle ahead of her. This was her moment to not just reclaim her voice, but to confront the man who had stolen so much from her. The trial had been grueling. Day after day of legal wrangling, of digging through the wreckage of her family's past. There were moments when it felt like the truth would never come to light, when she questioned if the pain would ever stop. But now, with each passing minute, she was closer to something she had never believed possible: justice. The judge called for the next witness. It was her turn. She stood up slowly, the weight of the room pressing down on her, her legs shaking, but she refused to let it show. As she walked to the witness stand, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her: judge, jury, Walter, and his lawyer, all waiting for her to speak. The girl's breath caught in her throat as she took the oath, her hands clammy as she placed them on the Bible. She was terrified, but there was something else rising within her, a quiet, unyielding resolve. This was her chance to finally break free. The prosecutor's voice broke the silence, warm and steady. "Miss Campos, please tell the court about your mother's relationship with Mr. Bishop." The girl closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a steadying breath, the memories flooding back. It was like reopening an old wound, but it had to be done. She had to expose the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "My mother," she began, her voice steady but raw, "was a strong woman. She loved me with everything she had. But there were things, secrets she kept. There were days when she was happy, when she would hold me close and tell me everything would be okay. But there were other days, dark days, when I would see the fear in her eyes, the way she would flinch when a car drove by or when someone knocked at the door. The words caught in her throat, but she pushed through. It wasn't until I was older that I understood why. She was afraid of him. She paused, letting her words sink in, and looked directly at Walter. She was afraid of Walter Bishop. She was afraid because he controlled her. He didn't just take her body, he took her spirit. And when she died, when she was taken from me, I realized he had taken her entirely. The courtroom was silent, but the truth hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Walter's face twitched, his mask slipping just enough for the girl to see the flicker of fear in his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't the powerful, untouchable figure he had been when she was a child. Now he was just a man who had been exposed for the monster he was. "Tell us about the arrangement your grandmother made with Mr. Bishop," the prosecutor asked. His voice gentle but firm. Her stomach churned as the weight of those words crashed down on her. This was the part she had dreaded. Her grandmother's role in her mother's destruction. But now, as she stood before the court, something inside her snapped. This wasn't just her mother's fight anymore. It was hers. And she wouldn't let her grandmother's choices define her any longer. "I found letters," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Letters where my grandmother, my own flesh and blood, agreed to sell me to Walter. She agreed to give me to him, just like she gave my mother. For a life, for money. I was nothing more than a pawn. I wasn't a daughter to her. I was a thing she could trade." Her eyes met her grandmother's across the room, but she couldn't read the woman's face anymore. The grandmother she had known was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. The girl felt the weight of years of lies crashing over her like a tidal wave. But this time she didn't flinch. This time, she was the one holding the power. Walter's lawyer jumped to his feet, shouting an objection, but the judge silenced him with a quick gesture. The truth was too loud to be ignored. The girl took another deep breath. "I won't let this happen to me. I won't be sold. I won't be controlled. I am my own person, and I will fight for my life. I will fight for the justice my mother never got." As she spoke those final words, something inside her broke free. It was as if the chains that had bound her for so long, the fear, the shame, the helplessness, finally shattered. She was no longer the scared girl who had been trapped in a cycle of abuse. She was the woman who was going to fight for everything she deserved. The prosecutor nodded, his face filled with understanding. "Thank you, Miss Campos. No further questions." She stepped down from the stand, her legs shaky, but her heart soaring. The battle wasn't over yet, but the girl knew something now that she hadn't known before. She could survive this. She could take back everything that had been stolen from her. The days following the trial felt both surreal and grounding. The verdict had been delivered. Walter Bishop would never harm anyone again, but the battle had taken its toll. As much as the girl had fought for justice, for her mother and for herself, the scars of the journey were deep. She had faced monsters both inside and out, and though the court had given her what she sought, retribution, the emotional toll would take time to heal. The weight of the past still hung over her like a dark cloud, but each day that passed, the burden lightened just a little. The girl stood at the edge of her future now, a future she had built with her own hands, no longer defined by the brokenness of her family or the cruelty of Walter Bishop. She wasn't free of the pain, but she was free to choose how she would live now. She had left the home she had once known, walking away from the silence that had consumed her. She had packed up the fragments of her life, leaving behind the place where so many memories of her mother and grandmother had been tainted by betrayal. But leaving wasn't the same as healing. It was just the first step. The girl moved into a small apartment in the city, a modest place, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to ask permission to live. She could set her own rules, decorate the walls, and choose who she wanted to be. There was no one there to remind her of her past or hold her to someone else's expectations. It was a quiet, empty space, but it was a fresh start. She started small, making her own meals, organizing her own life, doing everything she had never been allowed to do before. It felt strange at first, almost as if she were pretending to be normal. There were moments when the fear crept back in, when she felt the overwhelming urge to hide from the world and lock herself away. But she didn't, she stayed. She faced each new day, one step at a time, and bit by bit, the weight of the past began to loosen its grip on her heart. She spent hours reflecting on the lessons she had learned, the most painful one being that healing wasn't linear. There were days when the memories of her mother's pain threatened to overwhelm her, when the ghosts of her past came knocking, demanding her attention, but she refused to let them dictate who she was now. In the quiet moments, she allowed herself to grieve. She remembered her mother, not just as the woman who had been broken by Walter's cruelty, but as the woman who had loved her with all her heart. She remembered the good times, the laughter, the warmth, and she let herself cry for the woman who had never gotten to live the life she deserved. But she also let herself forgive her mother, forgive herself, for all the things that had been beyond their control. It wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about learning how to carry it without letting it destroy her, and that was the hardest lesson of all. Slowly, she began to rebuild. Not just her life, but her sense of self. She learned how to trust again, first in herself and then in others. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she feared opening up, when the thought of letting someone else in felt too risky, too vulnerable. But she knew deep down that if she didn't allow herself to love and be loved, she would remain stuck in the shadow of her past. She made new friends. She opened up to people who saw her as she was, not as the broken girl she had once been, but as someone strong, someone capable of creating her own happiness. She found a job that gave her purpose, a place where her skills and passions were valued. She even began volunteering at a shelter for women who had escaped abusive situations, using her story to help others find their voice, their strength just as she had. Each step was small, but each one felt like a victory. Healing was not a destination, it was a process. A lifelong journey that she would walk, not in haste but with patience, compassion, and understanding. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the world outside faded into stillness, she would think of her mother, and she would smile, knowing that her mother was proud of the woman she had become, the woman who had faced the darkest parts of her past and had chosen to heal, to love, and to move forward. The girl had learned that healing wasn't a perfect, linear path. There were ups and downs, setbacks and progress, but the key was to keep moving, one step at a time. Healing is a journey, not a destination. It's okay to take it one step at a time, and it's okay to not have all the answers right away. True strength comes not from the absence of pain, but from the courage to face it and move forward, no matter how difficult it may seem. Years had passed since the trial, since the moment when the girl, now a woman, had finally taken control of her life. The weight of the past still lingered, like a faint scar on her heart, but it no longer defined her. Her life had been rebuilt from the ashes of pain and betrayal, piece by piece, and now, as she stood in her modest home, she marveled at how far she had come. Her children, now teenagers, laughed in the next room, their voices full of joy and hope. For the first time in her life, she felt a deep sense of peace. The quiet of her home was filled with love. Love she had fought for. Love she had chosen to create. When her son, Michael, had been born, the world had felt both terrifying and full of promise. She had promised herself, over and over again, that he would never experience the darkness that had defined her early life. She had sworn to raise him in a home filled with love and respect. where the cycle of abuse and manipulation would be broken forever. And she had kept that promise. Michael was now a young man, his heart as full of compassion as her mother's had been, but without the shadows that had once clouded her mother's world. He had grown up in an environment of safety, of love, and had been taught from a young age the value of respect, not just for others, but for himself. His strength wasn't just about the muscles he had grown over the years. It was the quiet strength in his heart, the wisdom that came from knowing the value of kindness and resilience. He was a reminder to her that survival wasn't just about getting through the hard times. It was about using those times to build something better. She watched him now, sitting at the dinner table with his younger sister, Caroline, as they debated over a school project. Caroline, too, was growing into a strong young woman, her laughter filling the house, her bright eyes full of curiosity and hope for the future. She had inherited her mother's resilience, but her heart was unburdened by the same fears and scars. As the years passed, the woman often found herself looking back, not with regret, but with gratitude. The darkness of her past had shaped who she was, but it didn't define her. It was simply a chapter in a larger story, and now her children were living proof that the past didn't have to determine the future. Her strength, the lessons she had fought to learn, had been passed down to them. Her legacy wasn't just in the survival of her own story, but in the way her children carried that story forward, without the weight of the trauma, but with the wisdom gained from it. They weren't just living, they were thriving, and it wasn't just her children. The woman had become an advocate for survivors, a voice for those who had been silenced. She spoke at schools, at community centers, and to anyone who would listen. Her story, painful as it was, had become a beacon for others, showing them that it was possible to break free, to heal, and to build something new. She had been given the chance to rewrite her life, and now she was giving that gift to others. As she sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, she reflected on the journey from darkness to light. Her life had once been consumed by fear, by abuse, by manipulation. But now, as she watched her children grow, as she saw them flourishing in a way she never thought possible, she realized that survival was only the first step. Thriving, healing, and passing on that strength to the next generation, that was the true victory. She smiled to herself, a quiet peace settling over her heart. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer held the power to define her. And her children? They were free. They had been given the tools to live without the shadows of the past haunting them, to build a future grounded in love, respect, and the unshakable belief that they too could thrive. Survival is about more than just making it through the storm. It's about using the strength gained from those struggles to thrive, to heal, and to pass on that strength to others. It's about breaking the cycle, building a legacy of resilience, and ensuring that the generations that follow will carry the lessons of the past without carrying its pain. Now, years later, the woman, no longer just a survivor but a symbol of strength, sat by the window of her home, watching the sun rise over the horizon. The world outside seemed still, but inside she had lived a lifetime of lessons, of pain, and of healing. She had come so far from the young girl who had been trapped in fear, manipulated by her family, and haunted by the ghosts of the past. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, soft and steady even now. "You are stronger than you think. You just have to believe it." Those words had once felt like a fragile hope in the midst of the storm. Now, as she looked back on her journey, through the pain of betrayal, the battle for justice, and the slow, steady climb toward healing, she realized how true they had been. She had fought for her own life. She had found strength in the darkest of places, and piece by piece, she had rebuilt herself. But more than that, she had learned to trust again, not just in others, but in herself. The woman who had been broken had become the woman who could stand tall, who could look back on the past without fear, who could look forward to a future full of possibility. She thought about the legacy she was leaving behind, the children she had raised, the people whose lives she had touched through her advocacy and her story. The cycle of pain had ended with her, and the future she had built was one of love, compassion, and unwavering strength. As her gaze lingered on the view outside, she smiled softly. Life had not been kind, but it had made her resilient. She had learned that survival was not the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. If you are moved by this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of strength, resilience, and love. You never know who you might be helping today.